The final scrape of the straight razor against the back of my neck was always the punctuation mark at the end of a long week. It was a period, definitive and clean. For 7 years, that sound, followed by the soft brush dusting away loose hairs and the cool splash of bay rum, had been my ritual. My only ritual, if I was being honest. My life was a series of identical, beige-colored days that bled into one another, but Friday evenings at 6 o'clock, in Julian's chair, were in full, vibrant color. Julian's barbershop wasn't a throwback or a trendy imitation of one. It just was. It had existed on this quiet side street since his grandfather's time, and it smelled of things that lasted: old leather, wood polish, talcum powder, and the sharp, clean scent of barbicide. 2 worn leather chairs faced a long mirror, their chrome arms pitted with age. The floor was black and white tile, scuffed with the ghosts of 1,000 haircuts. It was a place of quiet, masculine comfort, and Julian was its steady, silent heart. He was a man built of calm, deliberate movements. There was never a wasted gesture, never a hurried snip of the scissors. Watching him work was like watching a sculptor or a painter. His focus was absolute. Tonight, as always, I watched him in the mirror. His reflection was framed by the dark wood of the mirror's edge, his brow slightly furrowed in concentration. His forearms, dusted with dark hair, were tense with precision as he folded the razor and wiped it clean on a piece of white linen. He moved with an economy that I, a man who spent his days correcting typos in legal documents, found mesmerizing. I had cataloged every detail of him over the years. The small, white scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the way his dark hair curled just behind his ears, the deep, low timbre of his voice when he'd greet me with a simple, "Leo," and a nod toward the empty chair. He rarely said more, and I rarely offered it. Our relationship was transactional, defined by the $15 I left on the counter and the perfect fade he left on my head. But for me, it was the most profound connection I had. It was pathetic, and I knew it. A 34-year-old man whose only meaningful human contact was a bi-weekly haircut from a man who likely didn't know his last name. But in that chair, under the warm weight of his hands as he guided my head, I felt seen. He was the only person who touched me. The thought was so bleak it was almost funny. My life was a desert, and these brief moments were my oasis. Tonight felt different. A heavy, late autumn rain had started to fall, drumming against the large front window and blurring the streetlights outside into hazy watercolors. I was his last appointment of the day. The shop, usually filled with the low murmur of conversation and the buzz of clippers, was silent save for the rain and the soft snick of his shears. The silence pressed in, heavy and intimate. He finished dusting my neck and pulled the paper collar away. The cape, however, remained. Usually, this was the moment he'd whip it off with a flourish, a signal that our time was up. But he didn't. He just stood behind me, his hands resting on the back of the leather chair, his gaze fixed on my reflection in the mirror. His eyes, the color of dark coffee, weren't looking at my haircut. They were looking at my eyes. My heart began a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. It was a look I'd seen before, in fleeting glances caught in the mirror, but it had never lasted this long. It was an unreadable look, intense and searching. I felt a flush creep up my neck, the same skin he had just cooled with aftershave. I could feel the heat of his body behind me, a solid, grounding presence that made the air in my lungs feel thin. What is he doing? My mind raced, a frantic scramble of hope and terror. Just take the cape off. Say, that'll be 15. Let me escape back into my gray life where things are safe and predictable and achingly lonely. He didn't move. The seconds stretched, each one a taut wire of tension. The rain outside intensified, a steady, isolating roar. We were in a bubble, the two of us, suspended in the warm, amber light of the shop. I could smell his scent, a clean mix of soap and something uniquely him, something warm and musky that I tried and failed to forget between appointments. Then he moved, but not to the cape. He walked slowly around the chair until he stood beside me, then continued toward the front of the shop. I watched his reflection, my own face a pale, anxious mask in the glass. He reached the heavy wooden door, and I saw his broad back tense as he reached for the deadbolt. My breath caught in my throat. There was a loud, definitive click. The sound echoed in the sudden, profound silence of the room. It was a sound of finality. A door closing, a world shrinking to the size of this one room. He had locked us in. Together. He turned from the door, his face in shadow, the light from the street casting a long, distorted silhouette on the tiled floor. He walked back toward me, his steps measured and unhurried. The casual confidence in his stride was at odds with the frantic, terrified bird fluttering in my chest. This wasn't part of the ritual. This was new. This was uncharted territory, and I didn't have a map. I am a man who plans. I plan my meals for the week. I plan my route to work to avoid traffic. I plan my retirement, a lonely, spreadsheet-driven fantasy of solvency. I do not do spontaneity. I do not do locked doors and intense, unreadable expressions. My entire existence was built around the avoidance of moments precisely like this one. He stopped directly in front of me, so close that his knees were almost touching mine. He was tall, and I had to crane my neck to look up at him. The mirror was gone. There was no reflection to hide behind, no safe, indirect way to observe him. It was just us, face to face. The air crackled. I could feel the electricity of it on my skin, raising the fine hairs on my arms. He reached out, his hand moving with that same infuriating slowness. I flinched, a tiny, involuntary jerk. A flicker of something, amusement, regret, crossed his face before it settled back into that calm mask. His fingers, warm and slightly calloused from his work, didn't touch my face. Not yet. They brushed against the starched fabric of the cape covering my chest, a feather-light touch that sent a jolt straight through me. "You're always so quiet, Leo," he said. His voice was even lower than usual, a gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in my bones. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. Not much to say, the words came out as a pathetic croak. A small smile touched the corner of his mouth. It was a devastatingly handsome smile, one I'd only ever seen him give to other people, never to me. "I don't believe that," he said softly. "I think there's a lot to say. You just don't say it." He knew. The thought hit me with the force of a physical blow. He knew. All these years of my silent pining, my carefully constructed walls of polite distance, my pathetic, secret adoration. He had seen it all. The heat in my face intensified, a burning wave of shame and exposure. I wanted the floor to open up and swallow me whole. I wanted to be anywhere but here, pinned by his gaze, dissected by his perception. His hand moved from my chest, up to my neck, his fingers tracing the fresh, clean line of my haircut. His touch was clinical, the way a doctor might palpate a patient, but there was an underlying warmth, a possessiveness that had no place in a barber shop. It was the touch of a man staking a claim. "7 years you've been coming here," he continued, his voice still that low, hypnotic murmur. "Every 2 weeks. Friday, 6 p.m. You've never missed an appointment. You've never been late." He was reciting the mundane facts of my life as if they were verses of poetry. He had been paying attention. While I was observing him, he had been observing me right back. The dynamic I had so carefully constructed in my head, me the secret admirer, him the oblivious object of affection, was a complete fabrication. We had been in a silent conversation for 7 years, and I was only just now hearing his side of it. His hand slid from the back of my neck, his thumb coming to rest just at the hinge of my jaw. It was a gesture of immense control, of gentle, undeniable power. He held my head steady, his gaze unwavering. My entire world had shrunk to the space between our faces, to the feeling of his warm skin against mine, to the scent of soap and rain and man that surrounded us. He leaned in closer. My eyes fluttered shut. I couldn't bear to watch, to see the rejection or pity in his eyes if I had misread this entire, insane situation. I could feel his breath on my cheek, warm and soft. The rain hammered against the window, a frantic, desperate rhythm that matched my own pulse. "Hold still," he whispered. The words were a command, but they were also a release. He was giving me permission to stop fighting, to stop overthinking, to just be. To be still and let this happen. My entire body went limp with a strange, terrifying relief. All the tension I had carried for years, the constant, low-grade anxiety of my lonely life, seemed to drain out of me, leaving me pliant and waiting. His thumb stroked my jawline. a slow, deliberate caress that was the most profoundly intimate thing I had ever experienced. It was a touch that said, "I see you. I've been waiting for you." And then his lips met mine. It wasn't a hard kiss or a demanding one. It was soft, searching, and impossibly gentle. It was a question asked without words. It tasted faintly of coffee and something sweet, like the mints he sometimes kept in a dish by the register. For a moment, I was frozen, my mind unable to process the reality of it. This was the stuff of my most secret, most deeply buried daydreams. It couldn't be real. But it was. The pressure of his mouth, the solid presence of his hand holding my face, the sound of his quiet breathing, it was all real. A wave of something hot and urgent washed over me, and my own lips parted, responding to his unspoken question with a desperate, hungry answer. My hands, which had been clutching the armrests of the chair in a white-knuckled grip, came up to rest on his forearms. The muscle there was hard and corded beneath his shirt. I gripped him, anchoring myself to this moment, terrified it would dissolve like a dream upon waking. The kiss deepened. His other hand came up to cradle the back of my head, his fingers tangling in the hair he had just so carefully cut. It was no longer gentle. It was possessive, hungry, a release of years of pent-up tension I hadn't even known he possessed. He wasn't the calm, detached barber anymore. He was just a man, and he wanted me. The realization was so overwhelming I felt dizzy. He finally broke the kiss, pulling back just enough for us to breathe. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed. His chest rose and fell in deep, ragged breaths. The shop was silent again, save for our breathing and the steady drumming of the rain. The moment felt fragile, like a soap bubble, and I was afraid to move, afraid to speak, lest I break it. "Leo," he breathed, his voice thick. "Julian," I whispered back. It was the first time I had ever said his name aloud in his presence, and the sound of it on my own tongue felt foreign and sacred. He pulled back completely, his hands dropping from my face. The loss of contact was immediate and sharp, a sudden coldness. My anxiety, which had been blissfully dormant, flared back to life. It was a mistake. He regrets it. He's going to laugh, or apologize, or tell me to get out. My mind supplied a dozen horrifying scenarios in the span of a single second. But he didn't do any of those things. He just looked at me, his dark eyes searching my face. There was a vulnerability in his expression that I had never seen before. The calm, confident mask was gone, replaced by a raw uncertainty that mirrored my own. "I've been wanting to do that for a long time," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Too long." Relief washed over me so powerfully my knees felt weak. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a moment of madness. It was real. It was reciprocated. "Me too," I managed to say, the words barely a whisper. "I mean, I've wanted this." A genuine smile spread across his face, lighting up his eyes and transforming his handsome features into something breathtaking. "I figured," he said, a hint of teasing humor in his tone. "You're not as subtle as you think you are." I groaned, burying my face in my hands. The embarrassment was back, hot and prickling. Oh God, was I that obvious? He chuckled, a low, warm sound that filled the small space. He reached out and gently pulled my hands away from my face. "You were, but I liked it." He took my hand, his larger, warmer one enveloping mine, his fingers laced with mine, a simple, perfect gesture that felt more binding than any contract, more intimate than any kiss. "I liked knowing you were watching me." He held my gaze for a long moment, then tugged on my hand. "Come on," he said. "Get out of the chair." I stood on shaky legs, the barber's cape still draped around my shoulders like a ridiculous superhero's costume. He reached behind me and unfastened it, letting it pool on the floor in a whisper of nylon. I was free of it, free of the role of customer. I was just Leo, standing in a locked barber shop with Julian, our hands still entwined. He led me away from the chairs and the mirrors, toward the back of the shop. There was a small door I had always assumed led to a supply closet. He opened it, revealing not a closet, but a narrow, steep staircase leading up. "My apartment's upstairs," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Granddad lived here his whole life. I took it over when he passed. He was sharing a piece of his life with me, a detail I never would have known otherwise. He was inviting me in, not just into his shop after hours, but into his home. The significance of it was not lost on me. He led me up the stairs. The air grew warmer, and the barbershop smells gave way to something more personal. The scent of coffee, old books, and a faint, lingering trace of the same cologne he wore. The apartment was simple and masculine. A worn leather sofa, shelves overflowing with books, a small, neat kitchen. A large window looked out over the rain-slicked alley below. It was a home. It felt like a sanctuary. He didn't let go of my hand. He led me to the sofa and sat down, pulling me down beside him. We sat in silence for a moment, just listening to the rain and the quiet hum of the old building. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was comfortable, easy. The frantic energy of the moment downstairs had dissipated, leaving behind a deep, peaceful calm. "So," he said, turning to face me, his thumb stroking the back of my hand. 7 years. I let out a shaky laugh. 7 years of me staring at you in the mirror. And 7 years of me trying to work up the nerve to lock that door, he confessed, his gaze soft. "Every Friday, I tell myself, today's the day, and then you'd pay, and you'd walk out, and I'd just watch you go." The thought of him, this confident, steady man, feeling the same nervous anticipation that I felt, was staggering. It recontextualized everything. Every brief, intense look in the mirror, every time his fingers seemed to linger for a second too long on my scalp, every quiet, "see you in 2 weeks," they hadn't been figments of my hopeful imagination. They had been real signals, invitations I had been too afraid to accept. "What made tonight different?" I asked, my voice barely audible. He looked toward the window, at the rain streaming down the glass. The rain, maybe. Seemed like the world was telling us to stay inside. And I was tired of waiting. "I saw the look on your face tonight when I was finishing up. The same look you always have. A little sad, a little lonely. Like you didn't want to leave. And I just thought, I can't let him walk out that door again." He was so perceptive. He saw right through the polite, quiet facade to the desperate loneliness underneath. He saw the real me, the me I kept hidden from the world, and he wasn't repulsed by it. He was drawn to it. He had locked the door not to trap me, but to keep me safe, to keep me with him. A tear escaped my eye, tracing a hot path down my cheek. I hastily wiped it away, embarrassed by the sudden surge of emotion. Julian reached out and gently cupped my cheek, his thumb brushing away the lingering moisture. "Hey," he said softly. "It's okay. It's just..." I struggled for the words. "I just thought this was how my life was going to be. Quiet. Alone. And I'd accepted it. And then you locked the door." "I'm not going to unlock it," he said, his voice a low, solemn vow. "Not until you want me to." And in that moment, I knew I never wanted him to. I wanted to stay in this sanctuary with him, in this bubble of warmth and acceptance, forever. The outside world, with its beige-colored days and its crushing loneliness, could wait. I leaned in and kissed him again. This time, there was no desperation, no frantic uncertainty. It was slow and deep and full of a quiet, dawning joy. It was a kiss that tasted of relief and recognition. It was the feeling of coming home after a long, long journey. My hands went to his face, my fingers tracing the line of his jaw, the slight stubble there, the scar through his eyebrow. I was memorizing him with my hands, confirming that he was real, that this was all real. He pulled away and rested his head in the crook of my neck, his arms wrapping around my waist, holding me tight against him. I could feel the steady, reassuring beat of his heart against my chest. I buried my face in his hair, inhaling his scent, committing it to memory. We stayed like that for a long time, just holding each other, two lonely people who had finally found their harbor in the storm. The rain eventually softened, its frantic drumming easing into a gentle, rhythmic patter. The world outside was quieting down, but the world inside this small apartment had just begun to make sense. He hadn't just given me a haircut. He had cut away the layers of fear and isolation I had wrapped around myself for years. He had held my head in his hands, looked me in the eye, and shown me that I wasn't invisible. He eventually stirred, pulling back just enough to look at me. The vulnerability was still there in his eyes, but it was joined by a quiet, steady hope. "Stay," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a plea. "Okay," I said, without a moment's hesitation. There was no other answer. There was nowhere else in the world I wanted to be. That night, I didn't go back to my empty, silent apartment. I stayed with Julian, in his home above the shop. We didn't do much. We talked. For hours, we talked. I told him about my boring job, and he told me about his grandfather. We shared stories that were small and unimportant to anyone else, but they were the building blocks of a new intimacy, filling in the silent spaces of the last 7 years. He made us coffee, and we sat on his worn sofa, our legs tangled together, my head resting on his shoulder. It was simple and domestic, and more profoundly romantic than anything I had ever dared to imagine. Later, we lay in his bed, the sound of the rain a soothing lullaby outside the window. He held me, his arm a heavy, comforting weight across my chest, his breathing a steady rhythm against my back. I had spent so many nights aching with a loneliness so deep it felt like a physical pain. But lying there, in the dark, wrapped in the arms of the man I had loved in silence for so long, I felt a sense of peace I had never known. I wasn't a customer. I wasn't an appointment. I was just Leo. And for the first time in my life, that felt like enough. I woke the next morning to the smell of coffee and the soft gray light of a post-rain dawn filtering through the window. For a split second, I was disoriented, the unfamiliar ceiling and the weight of the blankets confusing me. Then, the memory of the night before rushed back in, and I turned my head. Julian was sitting in a chair by the window, a mug in his hands, watching me. He wasn't smiling, but his expression was soft, content. "Morning," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Morning," I replied, my own voice thick with sleep. A familiar flicker of anxiety surfaced. The morning after, the moment of reckoning. He must have seen the fear in my eyes, because he stood up and came to sit on the edge of the bed. He reached out and brushed a stray piece of hair off my forehead. "I woke up feeling safe," he said quietly, as if admitting a long-held secret. "I haven't felt that way in a long time." His simple, vulnerable confession shattered my anxiety into a million pieces. He wasn't regretting it. He was feeling the same profound relief that I was. "Me too," I whispered. He leaned down and gave me a soft, chaste kiss. "I have to open the shop in an hour," he said. "First customers at 9. Reality. The world outside was still there. The ritual would have to continue, but it would be different now. Everything was different. "Okay," I said, sitting up. "I should go." "No," he said, his hand closing over mine on the blanket. "Stay. Have coffee with me. And when you leave—" He paused, his gaze steady and serious. "Leave your key on the counter. I'll make a copy." The offer hung in the air between us, simple and monumental. A key, an invitation to come back, an invitation to be a part of his life, not just for a scheduled appointment, but for all the quiet, unplanned moments in between. It was a promise of a future, of more mornings like this one. I looked at him, this quiet, steady man who had seen the loneliness in me and had the courage to lock a door against it. I thought of my empty apartment, my beige-colored life, and the 7 years of silent yearning. All of it had led me here, to this moment, to this man, to this simple, life-altering choice. I smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached my eyes. "Okay," I said. "I'll leave my key." My life used to have one punctuation mark, the clean, final scrape of a razor. It was a period at the end of a sentence I was tired of reading. But that night, with the sound of a lock clicking shut, Julian had changed the punctuation. It was no longer a period. It was a beginning.